I'd like to propose a toast. Every head on the Chateau Marmont rooftop turned at once, all eyes landing on the calm, unshaken voice that cut through the awkward silence. Cassandra Hartwell stood in her emerald silk dress, tears still glistening on her cheeks from her husband's public humiliation. She clutched her phone in one manicured hand, a mysterious smile playing at her lips. Some whispered sympathetically, others looked away in embarrassment. "Poor thing," someone murmured. "Preston really went too far this time." But Cassandra didn't flinch. What she said next didn't just destroy him. It exposed the biggest corporate secret in California history. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let me take you back to where this story really began, when she first decided that love was worth making herself smaller for. The October evening air in Beverly Hills carried the scent of jasmine and expensive perfume as Cassandra Hartwell adjusted the emerald silk dress that hugged her curves perfectly. The Chateau Marmont's rooftop glittered with crystal chandeliers and white roses, hosting what Forbes would later call the wedding of the decade. Tech mogul Trevor Kane had spared no expense for his marriage to supermodel Elena Volkov, and the guest list read like a who's who of California's business elite. Cassandra moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her mahogany skin glowing under the soft lighting. At 34, she possessed a quiet elegance that turned heads, high cheekbones that could cut glass, intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything, and natural hair styled in an intricate updo that showcased diamond earrings worth more than most people's cars. She wore confidence like armor, though tonight it felt more fragile than usual. "There's my beautiful wife," Preston Hartwell's voice boomed as he approached, Scotch already loosening his tongue. At 39, Preston cut an impressive figure in his tailored navy Tom Ford suit. Tall, athletic build maintained by his personal trainer, steel gray eyes, and perfectly styled blonde hair that screamed old money privilege. He was the kind of man who commanded boardrooms and country club conversations with equal ease. "Preston." Cassandra's smile was warm but careful. After 8 years of marriage, she'd learned to read his moods like weather patterns. Tonight's storm was building. "Come meet the Blackstone Group partners," he said, his hand finding the small of her back with possessive pressure. "They're discussing the Henderson merger." As they approached the cluster of men in expensive suits, Cassandra recognized the power players immediately. Gerald Murphy from Goldman Sachs, tech entrepreneur Brad Chen, real estate mogul Antonio Rivera. These were the titans who shaped California's economy with handshake deals and private jet negotiations. "Gentlemen, you remember my wife, Cassandra," Preston announced, his tone carrying that particular inflection she'd grown to hate, the one that introduced her as an accessory rather than a person. "Of course," Gerald nodded politely. "Preston, we were just discussing the new AI regulations. Your insights on the tech sector have been invaluable." Preston's chest swelled with pride. 20 years of building Hartwell Industries from the ground up teaches you a thing or two about market dynamics. Cassandra sipped her champagne and listened, her mind automatically processing the conversation's implications. The men discussed billion-dollar deals with casual familiarity, their words shaping entire industries. She could have contributed meaningful insights. Her Harvard MBA in international business and her secret portfolio of acquisitions gave her perspectives they couldn't imagine. But she'd learned long ago that her voice was unwelcome in these circles. "The key is understanding global supply chains," Preston continued, his voice growing louder with each drink. "Most people can't grasp the complexity involved." Most people, Cassandra thought, or most women who look like me. The conversation drifted to lighter topics as more couples joined their circle. Elena Kane, radiant in her Vera Wang gown, glided over with Trevor, both glowing with newlywed happiness. "This party is incredible," gushed Patricia Chen, Brad's wife, her red cocktail dress sparkling under the lights. "Elena," You've outdone yourself. Trevor handled most of the business negotiations, Elena laughed, her Russian accent adding exotic charm to her words. I just focused on making it beautiful. Smart division of labor, commented Gerald's wife, Margaret. Playing to your strengths. The comment hung in the air innocuously, but Cassandra felt Preston's energy shift beside her. She'd learned to recognize that particular tension, the moment when his need to assert dominance overwhelmed his better judgment. Speaking of playing to strengths, Preston said, his voice carrying across the circle, that's what makes a successful partnership. Knowing your role. Several heads turned toward them. Cassandra's stomach began to knot. Absolutely, agreed Brad. In business and marriage, you need clear lanes. Exactly, Preston continued, emboldened by the attention. Take Cassandra and me. I handle the complex business decisions. She handles the... He gestured vaguely, other things. The circle's energy shifted subtly. Cassandra felt eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious. This was familiar territory, the moment when Preston's casual condescension would escalate if not carefully managed. Preston, she said quietly, hoping to redirect the conversation. What, darling? His smile was sharp now, alcohol and audience combining dangerously. I'm just explaining our dynamic to our friends. Trevor, sensing tension, attempted to intervene. Marriage is definitely about teamwork. Elena and I are still figuring out our rhythm. But Preston was past the point of subtle redirection. The merger discussions had stirred his competitive instincts, and he needed to establish his position in the social hierarchy. The thing is, he continued, his voice carrying clearly across the rooftop, some people are natural leaders, and others are natural followers. It's not about intelligence. Well, not entirely. It's about having the right kind of mind for complex thinking. Cassandra's champagne glass felt heavy in her hand. Around them, conversations were beginning to pause as Preston's voice grew more animated. Preston, maybe we should... She began. No, this is important, he interrupted, his gray eyes gleaming with a particular cruelty that emerged when he'd been drinking. People need to understand how successful partnerships actually work. The circle was now fully focused on their conversation, other guests beginning to notice the tension. Cassandra could feel the familiar heat of humiliation rising in her chest, but something else was building too, a cold, calculating fury she'd kept carefully controlled for years. What are you thinking right now, honey? She wondered, looking at the faces around us and seeing your moment to shine by dimming my light? The October breeze stirred her dress as she stood at the precipice of a moment that would change everything. Preston's mouth was opening again, and she knew with sick certainty that whatever came next would cross a line they couldn't uncross. The wedding celebration continued around them, glasses clinking and laughter floating through the Beverly Hills night, but in their circle, the air had grown heavy with anticipation. Cassandra could feel destiny gathering like storm clouds, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she wanted to shelter Preston from the lightning. Think about this moment, she told herself, because after tonight, nothing will ever be the same. The moment stretched like pulled taffy as Preston swirled his scotch, savoring the attention of California's elite. The rooftop's ambient lighting cast shadows across his face, transforming his familiar features into something almost predatory. Cassandra watched him with the detached fascination of someone observing a car accident in slow motion, horrified but unable to look away. You see, Preston continued, his voice carrying the particular confidence that came from years of boardroom victories, marriage works best when both partners accept their natural capabilities. Some minds are built for strategy, others for... He paused, searching for the right words while his audience waited with uncomfortable attention. Cassandra felt her pulse quicken. The champagne flute in her hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Around them, the celebration continued, A string quartet played Pachelbel's canon in D while servers glided between clusters of guests with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, but their circle had become an island of tension in the sea of festivities. "Preston," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the music. It was a final warning, a last chance for him to step back from the cliff edge he was approaching. He either didn't hear her or chose to ignore the plea in her voice. "The truth is," he said, his gray eyes gleaming with a particular cruelty that alcohol unleashed, "not everyone can handle complex business discussions. Some people are better suited for simpler tasks." Gerald Murphy shifted uncomfortably, his wife Margaret suddenly finding her champagne flute fascinating. Even Trevor Kane, usually unflappable in social situations, looked like he wanted to disappear into the Beverly Hills night. But Preston was past reading social cues. The merger talk had awakened his competitive instincts, and he needed to establish his position as the alpha in their relationship. What he didn't realize was that he was about to detonate a bomb that would destroy everything they'd built together. "Take my lovely wife here," he said, his hand finding Cassandra's waist with possessive familiarity. Beautiful, charming, perfect hostess, but when it comes to business strategy or complex negotiations, well, let's just say we all have our strengths. The circle had gone completely quiet now. Patricia Chen stared at her husband, Brad, as if willing him to intervene. Elena Kane's face had flushed red beneath her professional makeup, her new husband's hand tightening protectively around her waist. Cassandra felt the familiar numbness spreading through her chest, the same protective disconnection she developed during childhood when her foster parents would discuss her future as if she weren't in the room. But underneath the numbness, something else was stirring. Something cold and precise and utterly unforgiving. "Preston, that's enough," Trevor finally said, his voice carrying the authority of a man worth $3 billion. "Maybe we should." No, this is important," Preston insisted, his voice rising above the string quartet. "People need to understand how partnerships actually work in the real world." He turned toward Brad Chen, seeking male solidarity. "You understand, right? In business, you need people who can think 3 moves ahead, who can see the bigger picture. Strategic thinking isn't something you can fake." Brad's face had gone carefully neutral, the expression of a man who'd built his fortune by knowing when to stay silent. But Preston misread his silence as agreement. "Exactly," Preston continued, his voice now carrying clearly across multiple conversations. Heads were turning throughout the rooftop as his words cut through the elegant atmosphere like broken glass. "Some people have that kind of analytical mind, and others." He gestured toward Cassandra with casual dismissiveness. "Well, others are better at different things." The humiliation was familiar, but the public nature of it felt like being skinned alive in front of an audience. Cassandra had endured 8 years of subtle condescension, of being introduced as just Preston's wife, of having her Harvard MBA dismissed as cute, and her business insights ignored. But this was different. This was deliberate cruelty performed for an audience of their peers. "He's actually enjoying this," she realized with crystalline clarity. "He's getting pleasure from making me small in front of these people." Gerald Murphy made one last attempt at damage control. "Preston, maybe we should discuss this privately." "Why?" Preston's laugh was sharp and bitter. "We're all adults here. We all know how the world works. Some people are cut out for high-level strategic thinking, and others aren't. It's not an insult, it's just reality." He turned to face Cassandra directly, his gray eyes holding hers with a mixture of fondness and condescension that made her stomach turn. The entire rooftop seemed to hold its breath. "Darling," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of their circle and beyond, "why don't you tell everyone about that time you tried to explain cryptocurrency to the Hendersons? Remember how confused you got with all those technical terms?" Several people in their circle actually gasped. Margaret Murphy looked like she wanted to crawl under the nearest table. Elena Kane's face had gone white with sympathetic horror. But Preston wasn't finished. The alcohol and the audience had unleashed something vicious in him, a need to assert his dominance that overrode every instinct for self-preservation. Or better yet, he continued, his smile sharp enough to cut diamonds, maybe Alicia should give a toast to the happy couple. Stand up and speak in front of everyone. His pause was theatrical, designed for maximum impact. Oh wait, she's not sharp enough to string a sentence together without tripping over her own words. The words hit Cassandra like physical blows. Around them, the elegant party continued. Crystal glasses chiming, laughter floating through the October air, the string quartet transitioning into a Mozart piece. But in their circle, time had stopped. She felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, that had been cracking for years under the weight of Preston's casual cruelty. No, this was something deeper. This was the final destruction of the woman who had spent 8 years making herself smaller, quieter, less threatening to protect a man's ego. The tears came without warning, hot and shameful against her cheeks. She tried to blink them back, but they fell anyway, dropping onto the emerald silk of her dress like liquid diamonds under the party lights. "Cassandra," Elena Kane whispered, her voice full of horror and sympathy. Preston's expression shifted as he finally registered the devastation on his wife's face. For a moment, the cruelty flickered and something almost like regret crossed his features. But it was too late. The words were out there, witnessed by 200 of California's most influential people. "Sweetheart, I didn't mean," he began, but Cassandra was already stepping back from his reaching hand. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the music and conversation. She turned away from the circle, away from the sympathetic faces and uncomfortable silence, away from the man who had just destroyed her in front of everyone who mattered in their world. But as she walked toward the edge of the rooftop terrace, something else was building inside her. The numbness was giving way to a cold, calculating fury that she'd kept carefully controlled for years. Preston thought he'd just put her in her place, shown their social circle exactly who held the power in their relationship. He has no idea, she thought, her tears drying as something harder took their place. He thinks intelligence is about making people feel small. He's about to learn what intelligence actually looks like. She reached the terrace railing and gripped it with both hands, her knuckles white against the metal. Below them, the lights of Beverly Hills twinkled like fallen stars, and beyond that, the vast expanse of Los Angeles stretched toward the ocean. Somewhere out there was her empire, the one Preston didn't know existed. "You want to see me speak in public?" she thought, turning back toward the party with something predatory gleaming in her dark eyes. "You want to see if I can string a sentence together? Let me show you exactly what your dumb wife is capable of." The transformation was complete. The woman who had walked away from that circle in tears was gone. In her place stood someone Preston had never met, someone who was about to show him that underestimating her intelligence was the biggest mistake of his life. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely underestimated your abilities? Sometimes the people closest to us can be the most blind to our true potential. Cassandra stood at the terrace railing for exactly 90 seconds, long enough for her tears to dry completely and for something far more dangerous to crystallize in their place. The October breeze carried the sound of forced conversation from behind her, the awkward laughter of people pretending they hadn't just witnessed social carnage. She could feel eyes on her back, a mixture of pity and curiosity from California's elite who were already composing the stories they'd tell at tomorrow's country club brunches. Poor Cassandra Hartwell. Did you hear what Preston said to her at the Kane wedding? Absolutely devastating. She turned slowly, her movements precise and controlled. The emerald silk dress that had felt like armor at the beginning of the evening now felt like war paint. Her reflection in the terrace's glass doors showed a woman transformed, The soft vulnerability that Preston had exploited for 8 years had vanished, replaced by something sharp and unforgiving. The party continued its elaborate dance around the elephant Preston had dragged into the room. Servers still glided between clusters of guests with champagne and canapés. The string quartet had moved on to Vivaldi, their notes floating through the Beverly Hills night like musical champagne bubbles. But the energy had shifted. Conversations carried an undercurrent of tension, and she could see people stealing glances toward their corner of the rooftop. Preston stood exactly where she'd left him, Scotch glass gripped in his hand like a lifeline. His face had gone pale beneath his country club tan, the cruel confidence of moments before replaced by the dawning realization that he might have miscalculated. Badly. Gerald Murphy was attempting damage control, his investment banker instincts kicking in. Perhaps we should all take a moment to. There's nothing to take a moment about, Cassandra said, her voice carrying clearly across the circle as she rejoined them. The tears were gone. The trembling had stopped. What remained was a woman who had just made a decision that would reshape everything. Preston's relief was visible. Darling, I'm sorry if. Don't. The single word cut through his apology like a blade. Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't make this worse than you already have. She turned to face the circle of witnesses, these titans of industry who controlled billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. Gerald Murphy with his Goldman Sachs connections. Brad Chen with his tech empire. Antonio Rivera with his real estate dynasty. These were the people who shaped California's economy with handshake deals and private conversations. Actually, she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, I think Preston is right. Some people are natural leaders, and others are natural followers. Some minds are built for strategic thinking, and others. She paused, letting his own words hang in the air like poison, are built for making assumptions. Trevor Kane shifted uncomfortably. His new wife Elena gripped his arm, her model's instincts sensing a dramatic shift in the evening's energy. Cassandra, Preston said quietly, warning threading through his voice. But it was too late for warnings. The damage was done, and now came the reckoning. You know what the fascinating thing about strategic thinking is? She asked, her gaze moving deliberately around the circle. It requires information. Real information. Not assumptions based on, how did you put it, Preston? Natural capabilities. Margaret Murphy exchanged a glance with her husband. They'd both witnessed enough boardroom coups to recognize the signs of an execution in progress. Cassandra reached into her small clutch purse, a Hermes piece that had cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and withdrew her phone. The simple gesture somehow carried the weight of inevitability. I've been thinking about giving a toast tonight, she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. Preston suggested I might not be able to string a sentence together, but I think I'd like to try. Cassandra, please. Preston's voice held a note of desperation now. 8 years of marriage had taught him to recognize her moods, and this was uncharted territory. The woman standing before him was someone he'd never encountered. Controlled, purposeful, and utterly without the deference he'd grown to expect. Please what? She asked, tilting her head with genuine curiosity. Please don't embarrass you the way you just embarrassed me? Please don't speak in front of people because I might say something simple. She turned toward the broader party, scanning the crowd of influential faces. Media moguls and tech entrepreneurs, real estate developers and investment bankers, politicians and entertainment executives. 200 of the most powerful people in California, all gathered to celebrate love and new beginnings. How poetic, she thought grimly. They're about to witness some very different kinds of new beginnings. I think a toast is exactly what this party needs, she announced, her voice projecting clearly across the rooftop. Something to really celebrate the happy couple and new revelations. Several servers stopped mid-stride, sensing the shift in energy. Conversations began to pause as word spread that something significant was happening near the terrace. The string quartet continued playing, but their music now seemed to underscore rather than mask the growing tension. Preston grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to leave marks. "Don't do this," he hissed, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." She looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. The silence stretched between them, loaded with 8 years of accumulated resentment and the specific cruelty of the last 10 minutes. "Let go of me," she said quietly. But her voice carried a note of absolute authority that made him release her immediately. Brad Chen cleared his throat. "Maybe we should all—" "No," Cassandra interrupted, her attention never leaving Preston's increasingly pale face. "I think we should stay right here. I think everyone should hear what Preston's intellectually inferior wife has to say." She could see the exact moment when Preston realized he'd unleashed something he couldn't control. His gray eyes widened with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. He knew her well enough to recognize that whatever came next would be devastating, but he had no idea of the true scope of the destruction about to unfold. "You see," she continued, her voice carrying clearly to the growing crowd of onlookers, "Preston is absolutely right about strategic thinking. It does require seeing the bigger picture, planning several moves ahead, understanding complex market dynamics." She paused, letting her words settle over the increasingly silent party. The string quartet had stopped playing, their instruments resting as they too sensed the dramatic tension building on the rooftop. "The question is," she said, her dark eyes fixed on her husband's face, "who exactly has been doing that strategic thinking in our marriage?" Preston's Scotch glass trembled in his hand. Around them, the circle of witnesses had grown as more guests drifted over, drawn by the unmistakable energy of a social earthquake in progress. "Darling," he tried one last time, his voice carrying a note of pleading that she'd never heard before. "Let's discuss this privately." "Privately?" Cassandra's laugh was soft and utterly without warmth. "After you just humiliated me in front of 200 people? After you called me too stupid to speak in public? No, Preston. I think the public deserves to hear what your simple-minded wife has been up to while you've been handling all those complex business decisions." She turned toward the crowd, her posture straightening with resolve. The transformation was complete. The deferential wife had vanished entirely, replaced by someone Preston was meeting for the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the rooftop, "if I could have your attention for just a moment, I'd like to propose a toast to the happy couple, and to the power of underestimating people." The party had gone completely silent now. 200 faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from fascination to horror to anticipation. Preston stood frozen beside her, his face ashen with the realization that he was about to discover exactly how wrong he'd been about everything. Cassandra raised her champagne flute toward the crowd, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "This should be interesting," she murmured, just loud enough for Preston to hear. "Let's see how well your strategic mind handles the next few minutes." The silence on the Chateau Marmont rooftop was so complete that the distant hum of traffic on Sunset Boulevard seemed deafening by comparison. 200 of California's most powerful people stood frozen in a tableau of anticipation, their champagne flutes catching the light from crystal chandeliers as they waited for whatever was about to unfold. Cassandra stood at the center of it all, her emerald silk dress catching the October breeze as she held her champagne glass aloft. The woman who had walked away from that circle in tears 15 minutes ago was gone, replaced by someone who radiated a quiet, dangerous confidence that made the air itself feel electric. "First," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the rooftop without strain, "let me say how honored Preston and I are to celebrate Trevor and Elena's union tonight. True partnership, built on mutual respect and recognition of each other's strengths, is something beautiful to witness." The words landed like carefully placed daggers. Elena Kane gripped her new husband's arm, her model's instincts recognizing the subtle violence hidden in gracious language. Trevor's face had gone carefully neutral, the expression of a billionaire who'd learned to weather unexpected storms. Preston stood beside her like a statue, his Scotch glass forgotten in his white-knuckled grip. The confidence that had carried him through decades of boardroom negotiations had evaporated, replaced by the dawning horror of a man who was beginning to suspect he'd been playing chess while his opponent had been playing a completely different game. "Marriage," Cassandra continued, her dark eyes scanning the crowd of influential faces, "is fascinating when you really think about it. Two people, supposedly sharing everything. Finances, dreams, daily decisions. Complete transparency and partnership." She paused, letting her gaze drift deliberately to Preston's increasingly pale face. "At least, that's the theory." Gerald Murphy shifted uncomfortably, his investment banker instincts screaming that he was about to witness a corporate takeover disguised as a wedding toast. His wife Margaret had gone completely still, recognizing the particular energy that preceded social annihilation. "Preston and I have been married for 8 wonderful years," Cassandra said, her voice warm with false affection. "During that time, he's built Hartwell Industries into what many consider one of California's most successful technology consulting firms. 230 employees, offices in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Quite impressive." The crowd murmured polite agreement. Hartwell Industries was well known in tech circles, though not quite at the level of the true giants represented at tonight's party. "What Preston might not have mentioned," she continued, her smile sharpening, "is that his lovely, simple-minded wife has been keeping herself busy too." The temperature on the rooftop seemed to drop 10 degrees. Antonio Rivera, the real estate mogul, leaned forward slightly, his developer's instincts recognizing the moment when a building's foundation was about to shift. Preston finally found his voice. "Cassandra, whatever you're thinking." "Thinking?" She turned toward him with genuine curiosity. "But darling, you just finished explaining to everyone that thinking, real, strategic thinking, isn't exactly my strong suit. So this can't be thinking. This must be something else entirely." She turned back to the crowd, her champagne glass catching the light as she gestured elegantly. "You see, while Preston has been handling the complex business decisions in our household, I've been pursuing some hobbies. Little projects to keep myself occupied." Brad Chen's wife Patricia whispered something urgent in his ear. The tech entrepreneur's face had gone sharp with attention, recognizing the tone of someone about to detonate a very expensive bomb. "For instance," Cassandra said, reaching into her clutch and withdrawing her phone with casual precision, "about 6 months ago, I became quite interested in renewable energy. You know how us simple folks are drawn to straightforward concepts like sunshine and wind." She swiped across her phone's screen with the fluid motion of someone accessing frequently used information. "Which is how I ended up acquiring controlling interest in Pacific Solar Dynamics. Lovely company. They supply solar infrastructure for about 40% of California's residential market." The silence that followed was deafening. Pacific Solar Dynamics was a multi-billion-dollar corporation whose stock moves influenced entire sectors of the renewable energy market. Preston's Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the rooftop stone flooring with a sound like breaking crystal. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Is it?" Cassandra asked, her voice carrying just enough innocent confusion to be devastating. "I suppose I should have mentioned it, but you were always so busy with your strategic thinking. I didn't want to bother you with my little hobby projects." Trevor Kane stepped forward slightly, his billionaire's instincts finally overriding social politeness. "Cassandra, are you saying you own Pacific Solar?" "Controlling interest," she clarified with a modest smile. 67%, to be precise. Though I suppose that distinction requires the kind of analytical thinking that... She gestured vaguely, echoing Preston's earlier dismissiveness. Well, you understand. The crowd was beginning to buzz with whispered conversations. Cell phones were appearing as people began frantically checking stock prices and business databases. Margaret Murphy was actually Googling Pacific Solar Dynamics, her face growing paler with each search result. Preston grabbed her arm again, his grip desperate now. This is insane. You don't have that kind of money. We share accounts. I would have seen. Share accounts. Cassandra's laugh was musical and utterly without warmth. Oh, darling. We share some accounts. The ones you know about. But you've been so busy explaining to people how I'm not cut out for complex financial matters that I didn't want to trouble you with the details of my trust fund investments. The words hit Preston like physical blows. His face cycled through confusion, denial, and dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. Trust fund, he repeated numbly. Did I forget to mention that? She asked with devastating innocence. My apologies. Sometimes I get confused about what I've shared and what I haven't. You know how scattered us simple folks can be. Elena Kane was gripping her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The model-turned-billionaire's wife recognized a masterclass in social warfare when she saw one. Cassandra turned back to the crowd, her phone still glowing in her manicured hand. But renewable energy is just one of my little interests. I've also developed quite a fascination with California's agricultural sector. Did you know that Central Valley Produce Corporation controls about 35% of the state's organic farming distribution? She paused, letting the information settle over the increasingly stunned crowd. They do now, anyway, since I acquired them last month. Another one of those simple, straightforward investments that appeal to minds like mine. Antonio Rivera was frantically typing on his phone, cross-referencing business databases with the speed of a man whose entire worldview was being rebuilt in real time. His face had gone ashen as the search results confirmed what Cassandra was telling them. Impossible, Preston repeated, but his voice had lost all conviction. The man who had humiliated his wife for lacking strategic thinking was beginning to realize that he'd been completely outmaneuvered by someone he'd dismissed as intellectually inferior. Oh, but we're just getting started, Cassandra said, her smile growing sharper with each revelation. You see, I've discovered that I have quite an appetite for... How did you put it, Preston? Complex business decisions. She swiped to another screen on her phone, her movements precise and confident. Which brings me to my newest acquisition. Something I finalized just this afternoon, actually, while you were at your very important lunch meeting with the Henderson Group. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the unmistakable energy of witnessing history being made. This wasn't just a marital dispute anymore. This was a woman systematically revealing an empire that no one had suspected existed. Preston's face had gone gray with comprehension. Cassandra, what did you do? She looked at him with a kind of patient affection one might show a slow child. I diversified my portfolio, darling. After all, a girl needs hobbies to keep herself occupied while her brilliant husband handles all the real thinking. Her finger hovered over her phone screen, poised to deliver whatever devastating revelation came next. The rooftop had gone so quiet that the sound of distant helicopters seemed to echo across Beverly Hills. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the party, I'd like to share some news about my latest business venture. I think you'll find it quite educational. Preston closed his eyes, bracing for impact. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to come. Have you ever witnessed the moment when someone's true power was finally revealed? Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones everyone underestimates. The anticipation on the rooftop was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. 200 of California's most powerful people stood frozen in a moment that would be whispered about in boardrooms and country clubs for years to come. Cassandra held her phone like a weapon, her finger poised over the screen that would deliver the final blow to everything Preston thought he knew about his life. "You know," she said conversationally, her voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing weekend plans, "I've always been fascinated by the consulting industry. All those brilliant minds advising companies on efficiency, strategy, market positioning. It takes such sophisticated thinking to understand how businesses really operate." Preston's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October evening, and his hands trembled as he gripped the terrace railing for support. "Particularly fascinating," Cassandra continued, "are the larger firms that handle multiple clients across different sectors. The ones that really understand the interconnected nature of California's business ecosystem." She paused, letting her gaze drift across the crowd of increasingly anxious faces. Gerald Murphy was typing frantically on his phone, his Goldman Sachs instincts screaming that he was witnessing a seismic shift in the state's power structure. Brad Chen had gone completely still, his tech entrepreneur's mind racing through the implications of what he was hearing. "Which brings me to my most recent acquisition," she said, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried clearly across the silent rooftop. "A little company called Strategic Business Solutions Group. Perhaps some of you have heard of them." The collective intake of breath was audible. Strategic Business Solutions Group was one of California's largest business consulting firms, with offices throughout the state and client contracts worth billions of dollars. They advised everyone from Fortune 500 companies to government agencies on operational efficiency and strategic planning. Antonio Rivera actually stumbled backward, his phone clattering to the stone floor as the implications hit him. That's impossible. SBSG is privately held by a consortium of international investors operating through a Delaware corporation? Cassandra finished helpfully. "Yes, I know. I organized that structure myself about 3 years ago. Amazing what you can accomplish when people assume you're too simple to understand complex financial instruments." Elena Kane was gripping her husband's arm so tightly that Trevor winced. The supermodel's survival instincts were screaming that she was witnessing the social equivalent of a nuclear detonation. Preston's voice came out as a strangled whisper. 3 years. You've owned SBSG for 3 years. Controlling interest, she corrected with maternal patience. 78%, to be exact. Though I suppose mathematical precision is another one of those complex concepts that might confuse someone like me. The crowd was beginning to fracture as people pulled out phones and tablets, frantically cross-referencing business databases and news archives. The implications were staggering. If Cassandra Hartwell controlled Strategic Business Solutions Group, she had access to the strategic planning documents of hundreds of major corporations. "But here's the truly interesting part," she continued, her dark eyes fixed on Preston's increasingly horrified face. "SBSG has been advising companies on acquisitions and mergers for the past 3 years. All those lovely reports about undervalued assets, market vulnerabilities, optimal timing for hostile takeovers." Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You'd be amazed how much strategic intelligence flows through a consulting firm that everyone trusts with their most sensitive planning documents." Margaret Murphy dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering against the stone with a sound like breaking dreams. "You've been using insider information to build your empire," she breathed. "Insider information?" Cassandra tilted her head with genuine curiosity. "That's such an ugly term. I prefer to think of it as research, due diligence, the kind of thorough analysis that really sophisticated thinkers use to make informed decisions." Trevor Kane stepped forward, his billionaire's instincts finally overriding social protocol. "Cassandra, what you're describing could be completely legal," she interrupted smoothly. I had the finest legal minds in California review every acquisition, every investment, every corporate structure. You see, when SBSG advises Company A that Company B is undervalued, and then a completely separate entity, say, a trust fund managed by offshore investment vehicles, acquires Company B 6 months later, there's no legal connection. Just coincidence. The word hung in the air like poison. Around them, California's elite were beginning to understand that they'd been completely outmaneuvered by someone they'd dismissed as a decorative accessory to her husband's success. Preston's legs gave out, and he sank onto one of the terrace's stone benches. "You've been planning this for years," he whispered. "All those times I explained business concepts to you, all those meetings where you seemed confused by financial discussions." "I was learning," she said simply. "Watching, listening, understanding exactly how you all thought, what you all valued, where your blind spots were." Her laugh was soft and utterly without warmth. "And your biggest blind spot, darling, was me." Brad Chen found his voice, though it came out hoarse with shock. "The Henderson Group deal, the one Preston's been working on for months. SBSG has been advising Henderson Group on their acquisition strategy since January," Cassandra confirmed. "Fascinating company, Henderson Group. They're about to announce the largest private equity deal in California history. Something about acquiring undervalued technology consulting firms and consolidating them into a statewide powerhouse." Preston's head snapped up, his gray eyes wide with dawning comprehension. "No, you couldn't have." "Couldn't have what?" she asked innocently. "Couldn't have advised Henderson Group that Hartwell Industries would be an ideal acquisition target? Couldn't have provided them with detailed financial analyses showing exactly how to structure a takeover bid? Couldn't have ensured that the acquisition happens at exactly the right moment for maximum impact?" The silence that followed was deafening. Preston stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, his mind struggling to process the scope of what she'd orchestrated. "You see," Cassandra continued, her voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining a complex concept to a slow student, "while you've been busy handling the complex business decisions in our marriage, I've been putting together the largest corporate empire in California's history. Pacific Solar Dynamics, Central Valley Produce Corporation, Strategic Business Solutions Group, and about 37 other companies that you've never heard of." She began counting on her manicured fingers, each name landing like a hammer blow. Northern California Real Estate Development, Bay Area Media Holdings, Sacramento Regional Banking Consortium, Orange County Manufacturing Collective. With each revelation, more phones appeared as people desperately tried to verify what they were hearing. The implications were staggering. If Cassandra controlled that many major companies, she wielded more economic power than most Fortune 500 CEOs. "But my personal favorite," she said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow carried clearly across the rooftop, "is a little investment firm called Hartwell Capital Management. Funny name for a company that your wife supposedly knows nothing about, don't you think?" Preston's face had gone completely white. "That's impossible. I would have seen the paperwork. The corporate filings are all filed under my maiden name through a series of Delaware shell corporations," she finished. "Another one of those complex legal structures that apparently confused me too much to bother you with the details." The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing absolute power being revealed. This wasn't just a marital dispute anymore. This was the emergence of a business empire that had been hiding in plain sight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cassandra announced, raising her champagne flute toward the stunned crowd, "I'd like to propose a toast to the power of being underestimated. To the advantage of letting people think you're simple while you systematically acquire everything they think they own." She turned toward Preston, her dark eyes holding his with the intensity of a predator who had finally revealed herself to cornered prey. "And to my dear husband," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the rooftop, "who just learned that his intellectually inferior wife owns 91% of California's major corporations, including the one that's about to acquire his company tomorrow morning." The champagne flute shattered against the stone floor as Preston collapsed completely, the sound echoing across Beverly Hills like breaking thunder. The champagne flute's crystalline fragments sparkled against the rooftop's stone floor like fallen stars, each shard reflecting the party lights in 1,000 different directions. Preston sat hunched on the stone bench, his face buried in his hands as the full weight of his wife's revelations crashed over him like a tsunami destroying everything he thought he knew about his life. The crowd of California's elite stood frozen in a tableau of shock, their faces cycling through disbelief, fascination, and the dawning realization that they'd just witnessed the most spectacular corporate reveal in the state's history. Cell phones buzzed constantly as people frantically fact-checked Cassandra's claims, their expressions growing more stunned with each confirmation. "Preston!" Cassandra's voice carried a note of genuine concern as she watched her husband's complete collapse. The predatory confidence that had carried her through the last 20 minutes flickered slightly, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of vindication and unexpected sorrow. He looked up at her with eyes that seemed to have aged decades in the space of an hour. 91%, he whispered, his voice hollow with disbelief. "You own 91% of California's major corporations." "Give or take a few percentage points," she confirmed, though her tone had lost its earlier sharpness. "The exact number fluctuates with market conditions and new acquisitions." Gerald Murphy stepped forward cautiously, his investment banker's instincts finally overriding his social paralysis. "Cassandra, the financial resources required for what you're describing would be astronomical. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. 437 billion at last month's valuations," she replied automatically. "Though that was before the Pacific Solar stock split, so the number's probably closer to 450 by now." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant hum of Beverly Hills traffic seemed deafening. Trevor Kane, worth $3 billion himself, stared at Cassandra as if she'd just claimed to own the moon. "That's impossible," Bradchin breathed. "That level of wealth would make you one of the richest people in the world." "Forbes would have." "Forbes tracks wealth that people want to be tracked," Cassandra interrupted gently. "Shell corporations, offshore trusts, Delaware holding companies. It's amazing how invisible you can become when you understand the right legal structures." "Another benefit of all that strategic thinking," Preston assured everyone I was incapable of. She turned back to her husband, who was staring at her as if she were a stranger wearing his wife's face. 8 years, Preston. 8 years of you explaining basic business concepts to me like I was a child. 8 years of watching you dismiss my opinions in front of colleagues and friends. 8 years of being introduced as just Preston's wife, while I systematically built an empire that dwarfs everything in this room combined. Elena Kane found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why? Why hide all of this? Why let him treat you that way when you had this kind of power?" Cassandra's laugh was soft and infinitely sad. "Because I loved him. Because I hoped that someday he'd see me as an equal without me having to prove it by destroying his entire worldview. Because I wanted him to respect me for who I was, not for what I owned." She walked over to where Preston sat, her emerald silk dress rustling in the October breeze. "Do you remember our 3rd anniversary dinner at Mastro's? You spent 45 minutes explaining to me why my suggestion about diversifying your client base was cute but impractical. The next day, I started putting together the financial backing for Strategic Business Solutions Group." Preston's head snapped up. "You've been planning this since the first time you called me simple in front of your colleagues," she confirmed. "Since the second time you explained compound interest to me like I'd never taken a mathematics class. Since the 100th time you introduced me as your beautiful wife, without mentioning that I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School. The crowd was pressing closer now, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing absolute power being revealed alongside devastating emotional truth. This had transcended business drama. This was the unraveling of a marriage in front of California's most influential witnesses. Harvard. Preston's voice cracked on the word. You told me you went to UCLA for art history. I have degrees from both, she said patiently. The art history degree was what I mentioned because it was safe, non-threatening, the kind of education that wouldn't make you feel insecure about your own credentials. Margaret Murphy was openly staring now, her social conditioning completely overwhelmed by the scope of what she was witnessing. You've been pretending to be someone else for 8 years? Not pretending, Cassandra corrected. Hiding. There's a difference. Everything you saw was real. My love for Preston, my desire to make our marriage work, my hope that he'd eventually see me as an equal partner. The only thing I hid was the scope of my capabilities. She knelt down in front of Preston, her designer dress pooling around her like liquid emerald. I could have told you about the trust fund when we first met. I could have mentioned that my deceased parents left me with connections to some of the most powerful investment networks in the world. I could have explained that my simple questions about your business were actually market research for potential acquisitions. Preston's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since his world began collapsing. Why didn't you? Because I wanted you to love me, not my portfolio, she whispered, her own voice breaking slightly. Because I thought if you could just see my intelligence, my worth, my contributions, then maybe we could build something real together. Antonio Rivera cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should give you two some privacy. No, Cassandra said sharply, rising to her feet with fluid grace. Privacy is what allowed this to fester for 8 years. Privacy is what let Preston humiliate me in front of everyone here tonight without consequences. She turned back to the crowd, her composure fully restored. I want everyone to understand exactly what happened here. A man publicly called his wife too stupid to speak coherently, and that woman turned out to own the economic infrastructure that supports most of your lives. The implications were starting to sink in for the gathered elite. If Cassandra controlled that many major corporations, she had influence over everything from their investments to their children's schools to the foundations that managed their charitable giving. The Henderson Group acquisition of Hartwell Industries will be announced at 9 a.m. tomorrow, she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who controlled billion-dollar decisions. Preston will receive a very generous buyout package, enough to maintain his lifestyle indefinitely, assuming he's careful with his spending. Preston looked up at her with a mixture of devastation and dawning comprehension. You're destroying my company to prove a point? I'm not destroying anything, she corrected. Henderson Group will expand Hartwell Industries into new markets, provide better employee benefits, and increase profitability by approximately 40% over the next 2 years. I'm making your company better than you ever could have alone. The words hit like physical blows. Preston staggered to his feet, his face cycling through denial, anger, and something that might have been recognition of his own culpability. This is insane, he said, his voice rising with desperation. You can't just own everything and not tell your husband. That's not how marriage works. No, Cassandra agreed, her voice soft but implacable. Marriage works through mutual respect, shared decision-making, and treating your partner as an equal. Would you like to explain to everyone here how well you've upheld those principles? The question hung in the air like a sword. Around them, 200 witnesses to their marriage's public destruction waited to see how Preston would respond to having his own behavior reflected back at him. For the first time in 8 years, he had no answer. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that had been 8 years in the making. Preston stood swaying slightly, his face cycling through emotions too complex and contradictory to process. Humiliation, rage, betrayal, and underneath it all, the dawning recognition that everything he believed about his marriage had been a carefully constructed illusion. "You lying manipulative," he started, his voice rising above the hushed whispers of the crowd. "Careful," Cassandra interrupted, her voice carrying a note of warning that cut through his building rage. "You're about to say something in front of 200 witnesses that you'll never be able to take back." But Preston was past caring about witnesses or consequences. 8 years of assumed superiority had just crumbled into dust, and his mind was grasping for anything that could restore his sense of control, his understanding of who he was in the world. "This is fraud," he said, his voice gaining strength as he found a narrative that made him the victim. "Corporate espionage. Using privileged information from consulting contracts to manipulate markets. You've been running an illegal empire while pretending to be my wife." Gerald Murphy shifted uncomfortably, his investment banker's ethics warring with his fascination at witnessing such spectacular wealth being revealed. "Preston, maybe you should." "No!" Preston's voice cracked like a whip across the rooftop. "Everyone needs to hear this. My wife," he spat the word like poison, "has been lying to me for our entire marriage. Building some kind of financial empire behind my back while playing dumb at dinner parties." Trevor Kane stepped forward, his billionaire's instincts recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. "This is getting personal. Maybe we should." "Personal?" Preston laughed, but the sound held no humor. "She just announced that she owns my company, that she's been manipulating business deals for years, that everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. How much more personal can it get?" He turned back to Cassandra, his gray eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and something that looked disturbingly like hatred. "You want to know what I think? I think you're a con artist. Some kind of sophisticated grifter who targeted a successful businessman and spent 8 years systematically stealing from him." The words hit Cassandra like physical blows. She'd prepared for shock, for anger, even for accusations of deception. But she hadn't anticipated this, the complete rewriting of their history to cast her as a predator and him as prey. "Stealing," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "I built my empire with my own inheritance, my own intelligence, my own strategic thinking. The same strategic thinking you've spent 8 years telling everyone I don't possess." "Prove it," Preston snarled. "Show me documentation. Show me where this mysterious trust fund came from. Show me how a woman who supposedly can't string 2 sentences together managed to acquire hundreds of billions of dollars in assets." The crowd was pressing closer now, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing a marriage implode in spectacular fashion. Cell phone cameras were emerging despite the exclusive nature of the event. This was too historic to go unrecorded. Cassandra reached into her clutch purse and withdrew a thick manila envelope that had been carefully folded to fit. Legal documentation for every acquisition, every trust fund distribution, every corporate filing. Reviewed by Morrison, Klein and Associates. I believe you know their reputation for thoroughness. She tossed the envelope at Preston's feet, the documents scattering across the stone floor like fallen leaves. 23 years of financial records, starting with my parents' life insurance settlement when I was 11 years old. Every investment decision, every legal structure, every acquisition mapped out in excruciating detail. Preston stared at the scattered papers as if they were venomous snakes. "This proves nothing. Documents can be forged. Shell corporations can be backdated. You've had years to create whatever story you needed." "Preston," Elena Kane said quietly, her model survival instincts screaming that he was destroying himself with every word. "Maybe you should look at what she's showing you before." "Before what?" he snapped. Before I accept that my wife of 8 years has been running some kind of shadow financial empire? Before I pretend that this isn't the most elaborate con job in California history? He kicked at the scattered documents, sending legal papers fluttering across the rooftop. You want to know what I think happened? I think you targeted me specifically. Researched my business, my social circle, my weaknesses. Then you crafted this perfect persona, beautiful, seemingly innocent, just intelligent enough to be interesting but not threatening. Cassandra's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. You think I spent 8 years of my life pretending to love you as part of some elaborate financial scheme? I think you're a sociopath, Preston said, his voice rising to carry clearly across the entire party. I think you identified a successful businessman with good connections and spent nearly a decade manipulating him while building your empire in the shadows. The words landed like bombs across the rooftop. Several people actually gasped at the brutality of the accusation. Margaret Murphy looked like she wanted to disappear into the Beverly Hills night. But Preston wasn't finished. 8 years of feeling intellectually superior had just been revealed as elaborate theater, and his ego was fighting for survival by rewriting the entire narrative. How many other husbands have there been? He asked, his voice dripping with venom. How many other successful men did you practice on before you perfected the act? Because that's what this is, an act. The loving wife, the supportive partner, the woman who just wants to make her husband happy. All of it calculated to keep me distracted while you systematically stole everything I've worked for. Cassandra stood frozen as her husband, the man she'd loved enough to hide her true self for 8 years, systematically destroyed every genuine moment they'd shared. Each accusation felt like acid poured over their wedding day, their anniversary dinners, the quiet Sunday mornings when she believed they were building something real together. I loved you, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heart breaking. Through every condescending comment, every public dismissal, every time you made me feel small in front of people who matter to both of us. I loved you enough to make myself less than I was because I thought maybe, someday, you'd see me as an equal. Love. Preston's laugh was ugly and sharp. You don't know what love is. Love is honesty. Love is partnership. Love is not lying to your spouse for 8 years while you build a financial empire behind his back. He gestured toward the scattered legal documents with theatrical disgust. This isn't love. This is the most elaborate revenge scheme in corporate history. And I was stupid enough to fall for it. The words hung in the October air like poison. Around them, 200 witnesses stood transfixed by the complete destruction of what had appeared to be a successful marriage. But the most devastating damage wasn't being done to their social standing or business relationships. The most devastating damage was being done to Cassandra's heart. She looked at Preston, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing her husband's face. The man she'd loved, the man she'd hoped would eventually see her worth, had just reduced 8 years of genuine affection to a calculated con game. He'd taken every moment of tenderness, every sacrifice she'd made to protect his ego, every compromise she'd accepted to keep their marriage intact, and rewritten it all as manipulation. You really believe that, she said softly, her voice carrying a note of wonder. You actually believe that I spent 8 years of my life pretending to love you as part of some elaborate scheme to steal your moderately successful consulting firm. I believe you're dangerous, Preston said, his voice hard and final. I believe you're a liar. And I believe our marriage is over. The words hit like a death sentence. Not because Cassandra hadn't seen them coming, but because they came from the mouth of a man who had just proven that he'd never known her at all. She stood in the wreckage of everything she'd thought they'd built together, surrounded by the witnesses to her public humiliation, and felt something inside her chest die permanently. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose it is. The aftermath of Preston's devastating words settled over the rooftop like nuclear fallout. 200 of California's most powerful people stood frozen in uncomfortable silence, their champagne glasses forgotten as they witnessed the complete disintegration of what they'd thought was a successful marriage. The string quartet had long since stopped playing, their instruments resting as even the hired musicians sensed that continuing would be obscene. Cassandra stood perfectly still in the center of it all, her emerald silk dress catching the party lights as she processed what had just happened. 8 years of marriage, 8 years of love, 8 years of making herself smaller to protect a man's ego. All of it dismissed as an elaborate con game by the person who was supposed to know her better than anyone else in the world. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute before Trevor Kane cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should all—" "No," Cassandra said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the rooftop. "Don't leave. Everyone should see how this ends." She turned to face Preston, who stood surrounded by the scattered legal documents like a man standing in the ruins of his own life. His face had gone pale beneath his country club tan, and she could see the exact moment when the adrenaline of his rage began to fade and reality started seeping in. "Preston," she said, her voice carrying the careful control of someone who had just made a decision that would reshape everything. "Do you remember our wedding vows?" He looked at her with suspicious confusion. "What does that have to do with—" "Humor me," she interrupted. "Do you remember what you promised me 8 years ago in front of our families and friends?" Preston's jaw tightened. "Cassandra, this isn't the time for— to love and to cherish," she continued as if he hadn't spoken. "In sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse. Until death do us part." She walked closer to him, her heels clicking against the stone with the precision of a countdown timer. "You promised to cherish me, Preston. Do you know what that word means?" Gerald Murphy shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the particular energy that preceded either reconciliation or total annihilation. His investment banker's instincts were screaming that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "It means to treasure," Cassandra continued, her dark eyes never leaving Preston's increasingly uncertain face. "To hold dear, to protect and nurture something precious. For 8 years, I believed you meant those words." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that only he could hear the pain underlying her controlled tone. "I believed them so deeply that I hid my own light to keep from making you feel small. I made myself less intelligent in public so you could feel more important. I pretended not to understand business concepts I'd mastered in graduate school so you could explain them to me like a patient teacher." Preston's breathing had become shallow and rapid. The documents scattered around his feet seemed to be mocking him with their evidence of everything he'd failed to see. "I convinced myself that love meant sacrifice," she whispered. "That if I just waited long enough, if I was patient enough, if I made myself non-threatening enough, eventually you'd see me as an equal partner instead of a beautiful accessory to your success." Elena Kane was crying openly now, her supermodel composure completely shattered by the raw emotion in Cassandra's voice. Several other women in the crowd had tears in their eyes as they recognized their own compromises reflected in her words. "But you never did you?" Cassandra asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. 8 years of marriage, and you never once asked yourself why your simple wife always seemed to ask exactly the right questions about your business deals. You never wondered how someone supposedly lacking strategic thinking could consistently offer suggestions that improved your client presentations. She gestured toward the scattered legal documents with elegant precision. "You never questioned how I always seemed to know which stocks to suggest for our portfolio, which real estate investments would pay off, which business connections would be most valuable for your company's growth." Preston's face was cycling through emotions too complex to process. Shame, denial, dawning comprehension, and underneath it all, the terrible recognition that he had systematically ignored evidence of his wife's intelligence for 8 years. "You want to know the truth about strategic thinking?" Cassandra asked, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the rooftop. Real strategic thinking requires seeing what's actually there, not what you want to see. It requires recognizing value even when it doesn't come in the package you expected. She turned toward the crowd of witnesses, her posture straightening with resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed a masterclass in failed strategic thinking. A man who spent 8 years married to one of the most successful business minds in California and never once recognized what he had. Antonio Rivera found his voice, though it came out hoarse with shock. Cassandra, what happens now? With the companies, the acquisitions, That depends, she said, her gaze returning to Preston's increasingly devastated face, on whether my husband would like to start over with honesty, or if he'd prefer to continue believing that I'm an elaborate con artist who spent 8 years pretending to love him. The choice hung in the air between them like a bridge over an impossible chasm. Preston stared at his wife, really looked at her for perhaps the first time in their marriage, and saw a woman whose intelligence he'd systematically dismissed, whose contributions he'd minimized, whose love he'd taken for granted while she built an empire in the shadows. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "If you had all this power, all this wealth, why did you let me treat you like you were less than? Because I hoped you'd love me enough to see me without having to prove my worth through destruction," she replied simply. "I wanted you to recognize my intelligence, my capabilities, my value as a partner. I wanted to be cherished for who I was, not for what I owned." She knelt down and began gathering the scattered legal documents, her movements careful and deliberate. "But you just proved that even when confronted with evidence of my capabilities, your first instinct is to assume I'm a threat rather than a partner. Your first response is to attack rather than to understand." Preston dropped to his knees beside her, frantically helping to collect the papers. "Cassandra, please. I was shocked. I was angry. I didn't mean." "You meant every word," she said quietly, not looking up from the documents. "And maybe that's what I needed to hear. Maybe I needed you to show me exactly what you think of me when your ego is threatened." She stood up with the reorganized papers, her expression unreadable. "You have a choice to make, Preston. You can continue believing that I'm a con artist who manipulated you for 8 years, in which case our marriage ends tonight and you'll receive the Henderson Group buyout package tomorrow." The alternative hung unspoken between them, loaded with possibility and impossibly high stakes. "Or," he asked, his voice barely audible, "or you can acknowledge that you've been married to someone you never bothered to truly know, and we can start building something real based on honesty and mutual respect." She looked at him with eyes that held 8 years of accumulated pain and the faintest glimmer of hope. "But if we do this, Preston, there are no more lies. No more pretending. No more making myself small to protect your ego. You'll be married to exactly who I am. All of it." Preston knelt on the rooftop, surrounded by the evidence of his own blindness, facing the choice that would determine whether their marriage could survive the truth. Around them, 200 witnesses held their breath, waiting to see whether love could triumph over pride, whether 8 years of genuine affection could overcome a lifetime of assumptions about power, intelligence, and what it meant to truly cherish another person. The next words spoken would determine everything. The October breeze stirred the scattered champagne flutes and legal documents across the Chateau Marmont rooftop as Preston knelt on the cold stone, surrounded by the evidence of 8 years of willful blindness. The party lights cast shadows across his face, highlighting the tears that had begun to fall as the full weight of his choices settled over him like a suffocating blanket. 200 witnesses stood frozen in the aftermath of devastation, their collective breath held as they waited to see whether a marriage could survive the complete destruction of its foundation. The silence was so profound that the distant hum of Beverly Hills traffic seemed to echo across the night sky. Preston looked up at Cassandra, his gray eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, his voice cracking on every word. I don't know how to be married to someone who's more successful than I am, more intelligent, more powerful. The admission hung in the air like a confession, raw and vulnerable in its honesty. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. This level of emotional nakedness was not what they'd expected from an elite Beverly Hills wedding celebration. More successful? Cassandra asked, tilting her head with genuine curiosity. Preston, do you think this is about competition? Do you think I built this empire to prove I was better than you? She knelt down beside him on the stone floor, her emerald silk dress pooling around her like liquid courage. I built it because you made me feel invisible. Because 8 years of being dismissed and patronized and explained to drove me to prove, to myself, not to you, that I was capable of strategic thinking. Trevor Kane stepped forward slightly, his billionaire's instincts recognizing a moment of genuine transformation. Maybe we should give you 2 privacy. No, Cassandra said firmly, her eyes never leaving Preston's face. Privacy is what allowed this to fester. Everyone here needs to witness how this ends, either in honest partnership or in the complete destruction of everything we thought we'd built together. She reached out and touched Preston's face with gentle fingers, wiping away tears he didn't realize he was crying. You want to know what real strategic thinking looks like? It's recognizing that love isn't about who's more powerful or more intelligent. It's about seeing your partner clearly and choosing to cherish them anyway. Preston caught her hand in both of his, gripping it like a lifeline. I see you now, he said, his voice breaking with the weight of recognition. God, Cassandra, I see you now, and I'm terrified. Of what? She asked softly. Of how badly I failed you. Of how many times I made you small when you were already magnificent. Of how you could forgive 8 years of being blind to who you really are. He looked around at the scattered legal documents, each one representing a business decision that dwarfed anything he'd ever accomplished. $400 billion. You control $400 billion in assets, and I spent 8 years explaining compound interest to you like you were a child. Elena Kane was openly sobbing now, her supermodel composure completely shattered by the raw emotion unfolding in front of them. Gerald Murphy had put his arm around his wife Margaret, both of them recognizing the sacred nature of what they were witnessing. The money doesn't matter, Cassandra said, her voice carrying clearly across the rooftop. The companies, the acquisitions, the empire, none of it matters if the person I love can't see me as an equal partner. She stood up, pulling Preston to his feet with her. But you need to understand something. If we rebuild this marriage, it's built on truth. All of it. You'll be married to a woman who owns more than 90% of California's major corporations, who influences policy decisions that affect millions of people, who makes strategic decisions that reshape entire industries. Preston's breathing had steadied, though his face remained pale with the enormity of what he was processing. I want to try, he said simply. I want to learn how to be married to the woman you actually are, not the woman I convinced myself you were. It won't be easy, she warned. Your ego will struggle with dinner parties where I know more about the business being discussed than you do. With social situations where people defer to my expertise instead of yours. With the reality that your wife is one of the most powerful people in California. He nodded slowly, his gray eyes holding hers with new clarity. I think part of me always knew. Those perfect stock suggestions. Those business insights that were always just a little too sharp, too well-informed. I chose not to see it because it was easier to feel superior than to acknowledge that I was married to someone extraordinary. Cassandra felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Not forgiveness, that would take time, but the possibility of rebuilding something real from the ashes of their comfortable lies. There's something else, she said, reaching into her clutch purse one final time. She withdrew a single document, sealed in an elegant envelope. The Henderson Group acquisition of Hartwell Industries? It doesn't have to happen. Preston stared at the envelope as if it contained either salvation or damnation. What do you mean? I mean the acquisition was structured to give you a choice, she explained, her voice taking on the confident tone of someone accustomed to controlling billion-dollar decisions. You can accept the buyout. It's generous enough to set you up for life, and Henderson Group will expand your company beyond anything you could have achieved alone. She paused, letting the implications settle. Or you can retain ownership and accept me as a silent partner. My resources, my connections, my strategic expertise, all of it available to help you build Hartwell Industries into something that could compete with the largest consulting firms in the country. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing not just personal reconciliation, but a potential business partnership that could reshape California's consulting industry. A silent partner? Preston repeated. Silent in the sense that your name stays on the door. Your leadership remains visible to clients and employees, she clarified. But honest in the sense that we both know where the strategic thinking and financial backing are coming from. She held out the envelope. The choice is yours, Preston. We rebuild our marriage and our business as equal partners, or we end both with dignity and move forward separately. Preston took the envelope with trembling hands, but he didn't open it. Instead, he looked around at the 200 witnesses who had watched their marriage implode and potentially resurrect itself in the span of 2 hours. 8 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the rooftop, I married the woman I thought was perfect for me. Tonight I discovered that I actually married the woman who was perfect for me. I was just too arrogant to notice. He turned back to Cassandra, his eyes bright with tears and possibility. I want to learn how to be worthy of the partner I actually have, not the one I pretended you were. It will require humility, she warned. I'm learning about humility, he replied with a shaky smile. It will require recognizing my intelligence publicly, celebrating my successes instead of feeling threatened by them. I want to celebrate everything about you that I was too blind to see. And it will require trust, she said, her voice softening. Trust that I spent 8 years building an empire not to destroy you, but because I needed to prove to myself that I was worthy of being loved by someone I respected. Preston stepped closer to her, the legal documents crunching under his feet as he closed the distance between them. Cassandra Hartwell, he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the rooftop. Will you marry me again? Not the woman I thought you were, but the woman you actually are. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had broken her heart and potentially just earned the chance to rebuild it. Around them, California's elite held their breath, waiting to see whether love could triumph over 8 years of accumulated damage. Yes, she said simply. But this time, we build it on truth. As Preston's lips met hers in a kiss that tasted of tears, champagne, and new beginnings, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Not the polite social clapping of a successful party, but the genuine celebration of witnessing something rare and precious. The moment when two people chose love over pride, honesty over comfort, and the hard work of real partnership over the easy assumptions of a beautiful lie. Later, the society pages would call it the most dramatic wedding reception in Beverly Hills history. But for Cassandra and Preston, it was simply the first day of a marriage built on seeing each other clearly and choosing to love what they found. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't conquering your opponent. It's helping them become worthy of fighting beside you. The most powerful thing you can do is show someone who you really are, even if it destroys everything you thought you'd built together. Love that survives the truth is the only love worth having. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone's ego and showing your true self? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe for more stories about the power of truth in relationships. And remember, the people who truly love you will celebrate your success, not feel threatened by it. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.